Looks like I'm live. Hooray. Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be back here with you for another Bibliotherapy live session. And tonight I'm going to be talking about my favourite books of 2020. And I'm also going to give recommendations for bookish presents for your friends and relatives. So if anyone's got any questions, if they'd like to send in a query about a friend or a relative who would love a book and they're wondering which book to give them, please send me a message either on Facebook or on Instagram, or you can tweet me, though I don't know if I'll see that right now. So the best thing to do now is to try and do it on Facebook or Instagram. Ollie, great to see you, and thanks for loving my hat. I'm actually covering up my lockdown hair because it's not looking at its best. And I'm also just feeling like I'm in Australia because one of the books I'm going to be talking about is set in Australia. So let's get started on the books of 2020 that have really stood out and got us through this year of all years of strange weirdness. And actually, I'd love to hear about your favourite books of the year too. If you want to send me messages telling me which books got you through this year, I would love to hear about those. So, the first book that I want to talk about is one that I haven't actually had a chance to talk about yet on these sessions, which is Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, which is a very unusual, strange, and wonderful book by Susanna Clarke, who is very well known for having written Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a huge, fat tome of a book, very heavy. And she then didn't write another book for 10 years. And finally, she has given us this superbly beautiful and puzzle like book, which is actually disappointingly short. I absolutely loved it and wished that it was going on a lot longer. It is a book which is very difficult to describe. It's unlike anything else. Hi, David and Estelle. It's great to see you here this evening as well. And thanks for joining me on Instagram to many people. Lovely to see you here tonight. Do send me messages telling me which books have got you through 2020. And do also send me any questions asking about which books you want to give to people, which relatives and friends you want to give books to, and any dilemmas you might have about those books. So, Piranesi, it's a book I don't want to tell you too much about, other than saying you must read it. And it also does make an amazing gift, definitely for almost anyone. I would say it would make a great gift for a curious teenager, but also to any adult friends in your life who enjoy a bit of a mystery and a strangely beautiful puzzle, which is the best way of describing this book. I will read you a little bit from the book to give you a sense of the prose. It's written in a kind of almost biblical way. It actually has a lot of capital letters on the pages because the narrative voice is in the voice of the character called Piranesi, who seems to live in a kind of labyrinth where there are statues coming out of halls which are swept periodically by oceans and waves. But there are also pavements in these halls. It's a really strangely odd and beautiful book, and I'm going to read you a little bit to give you a flavour of the way that she writes in this book. This chapter is called Statues. It's the entry for the 18th day of the 5th month in the year the albatross came to the southwestern halls. There are some statues that I love more than the rest. The woman carrying a beehive is one. Another, perhaps the statue that I love above all others, stands at a door between the 5th and 4th northwestern halls. It is the statue of a faun, a creature half man and half goat, with a head of exuberant curls. He smiles slightly and presses his forefinger to his lips. I have always felt that he meant to tell me something, or perhaps to warn me of something. Quiet, he seems to say. Be careful. But what danger there could possibly be, I have never known. I dreamt of him once. He was standing in a snowy forest and speaking to a female child. The statue of a gorilla that stands in the 5th northern hall always catches my eye. He is depicted squatting on his lower limbs, leaning forward and propping himself up on his powerful arms and fists. His face fascinates me. His great brow overshadows his eyes, and in a human person this expression would be called a scowl. But in the gorilla it seems to mean the exact opposite. He represents many things, among them peace, tranquility, strength, and endurance. There are many others that I love. The young boy playing the cymbals, the elephant carrying a castle, the two kings playing chess. The last I will mention is not exactly a favourite. Rather, it is a statue, or to be more exact, a pair of statues that never fails to arrest my attention whenever I see it. The two statues flank the eastern door of the first western hall. They are approximately 6 meters tall and have two unusual features. Firstly, they are much larger than the other statues in the first western hall. Secondly, they are incomplete. Their trunks emerge from the wall at their waists, their arms reach back to push mightily, their muscles swell with the effort, and their faces are contorted. They are not comfortable to contemplate. They seem to be in pain, struggling to be born. The struggle may be fruitless, and yet they do not give up. Their heads are extravagantly horned, and so I have named them the Horned Giants. They represent endeavour and the struggle against a wretched fate. Is it disrespectful to the house to love some statues more than others? I sometimes ask myself this question. It is my belief that the house itself loves and blesses equally everything that it has created. Should I try to do the same? Yet, at the same time, I can see that it is in the nature of men to prefer one thing to another, to find one thing more meaningful than another. So that's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which is a strangely magical and wonderful book. It is one that I've actually read 3 times. I loved it so much. It's also brilliant on audio, by the way. And it's a book that you will keep wondering what it's all about. You may find the first few pages you're thinking, this is just too strange and I really am never going to get into it, which is what happened to me the first time I read it. But then I became absolutely hooked. And it's a book which does keep giving you more and more amazing inspiration and ideas. It takes you into a unique, wonderful, quiet, calm place. And I think that's the reason I love it for 2020. It's a book of amazing peace and tranquility, even though what it's describing is actually not really that peaceful and tranquil when you come to understand what's going on. But I'm not going to tell you any more about it because I really don't want to spoil the story. Just do read it or give it as a present to lots of your friends and relatives because it really is a beautiful and very rewarding book. I'm now going to talk to you next about Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which is another gorgeous book and one which would again be a fantastic present to probably any friend or relative. Anyone with an interest in Shakespeare is going to love this book because it is the story of Shakespeare's son, Hamnet. But it's a book that, frankly, anyone with interest in humanity and history will also love. It is a book set in a world of the plague, and according to Maggie O'Farrell, it is the bubonic plague that does for Hamnet, Shakespeare's son, when he's only 11 years old. And that's also one of the reasons I feel that this was such a great book to read this year. And it still is a fantastic book to read because this is a year which, of course, we have been thinking about plague and other such related matters, how viruses spread. And Maggie O'Farrell very graphically and brilliantly does describe the spread of the plague and how it comes to the son of William Shakespeare and his wife Agnes. It's a great and interesting trope in the book that Maggie O'Farrell doesn't actually name Shakespeare at any point. The story is very much told through the eyes of Agnes. Well, it's all about Agnes. It's actually not written in her narrative voice. It's written from an outsider's view, but it describes the boy, Hamnet, his sister, Judith, who is his twin, and the family around them and their life in Stratford upon Avon. It's beautifully, brilliantly done. It's very sad, obviously, with the boy dying, and we know from the beginning of the book that he is going to die, and it is of course based on truth. Shakespeare's son really did die aged 11. It's not absolutely sure whether it was the plague that killed him, but it's quite likely and it's believed that that was the case. So the novel beautifully evokes the complex family dynamic in this much speculated about family of 400 years ago. It all unfolds in the town of Stratford St Mary, with occasional forays to London where we see Shakespeare with his actors and his troupe trying to make a living for his family. It's playful, tender, mysterious, and totally original. And it's absolutely one of my favourite books of this year. I'm going to read you just a little bit from it to give you a flavour of the book, and it will give you a sense of how beautifully Maggie O'Farrell evokes the magical strangeness of this era and how she brings to life what it would have been like to live at that time. Here she's talking about Hamnet himself, the boy. The noise of a bird in the sky can make him cease speaking mid-utterance, as if the very heavens have struck him deaf and dumb at a stroke. The sight of a person entering a room out of the corner of his eye can make him break off whatever he is doing, eating, reading, copying out his schoolwork, and gaze at them as if they have some important message just for him. He has a tendency to slip the bounds of the real, tangible world around him and enter another place. He will sit in a room in body, but in his head he is somewhere else, someone else, in a place unknown only to him. "Wake up, child," his grandmother will shout, snapping her fingers at him. "Come back," his older sister Susanna will hiss, flicking his ear. "Pay attention," his schoolmasters will yell. "Where did you go?" Judith will be whispering to him when he finally re-enters the world, when he comes to, when he glances around to find that he is back in his house, at his table, surrounded by his family, his mother eyeing him, half smiling, as if she knows exactly where he's been. So you can tell from that that Maggie O'Farrell, as she does with all her novels, really gets into the heart of the character and brings him to life in an absolutely fantastic and believable way. And she also has that beautiful relationship between the son and the mother, which she also brings to life between the twins, who have a very strong bond. They have a bond which is so strong that they sometimes swap places with each other, and not always with happy consequences, as will be discovered in this book. So this is a really fantastic read. Although it is about the death of Hamnet, it is a book that's actually full of joy and positivity as well. It's not actually a doom and gloom kind of book at all, strangely enough, even though we do have the plague traipsing around the edge of the book. It's a book which Patrick Gale says is heart-stopping. Marian Keyes says is stunning. O'Farrell's best book yet. And I would really recommend it as a brilliant read, but also as a lovely gift book. So moving on from Hamnet, one of my favourite books of the year, Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce is a really fabulous, gorgeous book, which is also one of the ones that I've most loved this year and hugely enjoyed. This is a book which is almost unbridled joy. I suppose Hamnet is one which has an amazing depth and profundity to it, and also being set in the era of Shakespeare and tackling Shakespeare himself. It's a book with a lot of weight. Miss Benson's Beetle is a really gorgeous adventure telling the story of two women who go across the world to find a golden beetle. It's a book that when I first read it completely took me by surprise. Rachel Joyce has famously written The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, which is also a really fabulous book, and she wrote Perfect. And this book is one which takes her into whole new territories. It's set in the 1950s, and it's about our main character, Marjorie Benson, who is stuck in a dead-end job. She's miserable and she's a spinster. But one day she decides to jack it all in, leave her boring teaching job where she's stuck in a school. She steals the headmistress's lacrosse boots, which is quite a surreal thing to do, and waltzes off with them into the unknown. And she decides to fulfill her childhood dream, which was to find the golden beetle of New Caledonia, which is a beetle that her father told her about and which she'd once seen in a picture book. But no one has ever found the real thing and brought it back and annotated it and brought a specimen back to the museum, the Natural History Museum, which is what she becomes obsessed with doing. So she sets forth on a boat to sail across the world after having advertised for someone to come and help her and join her on this adventure. She gets a lot of quite practical applicants, and the person that ends up getting the job is the least practical woman called Enid Pretty, who turns up onto the boat wearing all pink and wearing a hat, a bit like this, but a pink one. And off they go together round the world to the literal other side of the world to find the golden beetle. Enid Pretty actually has no interest at all in beetles, but she does find her way to becoming a vital member of the trip. And it's a rollicking read. I really very highly recommend it. I would also say it is an excellent present to give to people because it's almost guaranteed, I feel, to make them laugh and cry, because it does have very moving moments too. And it's really all about the power of female friendship, but it's also about the importance of following your dream. I'm going to read you a bit to give you a sense of the way that she captures characters so brilliantly. So this is Rachel Joyce, Miss Benson's Beetle. Enid has just had a miscarriage on the boat. So sorry about spoilers, but as you'll see, it's only a third of the way through, so I'm not ruining anything too much. Enid said she was afraid she was disappearing. When she was pregnant, she knew she was alive, and with every baby she lost, another part of her slipped free. Marjorie fetched treats to distract her, an egg sandwich, a bottle of nail colour. It made no difference. Enid stayed on the top bunk, crying and beginning to smell, with her new battery radio pressed to her ear so that she could hear the General Overseas Service. A few people knocked on the door, but she wouldn't see them, not even Taylor. Marjorie had no idea you could be so slight and yet carry something so painful inside. And it wasn't as if what Enid wanted was glorious. She just wanted to be a mother, one of the most ordinary achievements in the world. When it had occurred to Marjorie in her late 30s that she would never have a child, she had not allowed herself to grieve. It had simply been another of those things that marked her apart. And nursing, that didn't come at all naturally. Unlike Enid, who would happily have cared for every lonely or sick person who so much as coughed at her, Marjorie was uncomfortable with the role. No one in her life had ever asked her for help. In fact, they'd done the exact opposite. Her aunts had endured illness as if it were vulgar to admit defeat, and Marjorie was afraid of getting it wrong. She suggested Enid might like a walk, but Enid said she couldn't bear to go where she might see kids. She didn't want to be alone either, so Marjorie hung up her frocks and put the lids on her jars, then sat on the yellow chair and talked about whatever she could think of. And since she ran out of things pretty quickly, she told Enid about the gold beetle, then showed her other specimens in her books. The gold beetle will be about the size of a ladybird, but not as round, and it will have very long antennae, you see, because it is a pollinator. It lives on the white orchid. Now this one is a leaf weevil, etc., etc. Enid says, it is nice. What is? This, you telling me about beetles. It's cosy. So the last thing Marjorie expected was what Enid did next. And I won't tell you what that was because I don't want to spoil the story. I'm getting a couple of people sending me in their favourite books of the year. Thank you very much for joining in. Sam, you said you loved Moneyland, the inside story of the crooks and kleptocrats who rule the world. Sam says it put me in a perpetual state of fury, which was very invigorating. That sounds like a great suggestion, Sam. I'm going to look that up. And I like the idea of a perpetual state of fury being an aspect of bibliotherapy, which is clearly a good and positive one. I'm going to think further about that. Helen says, my favourite of the year is Fresh Water for Flowers, which is not a book that I've read. Is that fiction or non-fiction? Helen, do let me know. That's an interesting recommendation. Thank you for that. I'm now going to tell you about another book, which is one that I have mentioned on a previous session. And I'm just trying to find my my version of that book, which seems to have fallen down onto the floor. Oh, here we are. Because I don't have the actual book. I've only got a representation of it as I listened to it on audio. And I lent the book to someone. Sadly, not getting it back in time for tonight. Anyway, Leonard and Hungry Paul by Ronan Hession is one of my favourites of this year, which I absolutely loved. It's a very quiet book. It's a book that I would probably give to maybe a cousin or a male uncle who possibly lives on his own, perhaps a bachelor, but it's also a lovely book for anyone to read, frankly. It is a quiet book. It's not one full of adventure and drama. So it's a book for maybe someone who is thoughtful and who is going to appreciate a book that's more about appreciating the small things in life than having major dramas, crime, or thrillers. Um, Katie, you're just telling me that you loved Little Big by John Crowley. Thank you, but you're saying it's not new. That sounds really interesting, and I'm going to check that out. But I'll just tell you a bit about Leonard and Hungry Paul for people that don't know about it. It's a novel about two men who are both in their 30s and they both still live at home. They're fast friends and they spend most evenings playing board games together. I love these men, Leonard and Hungry Paul. It's never explained why Hungry Paul is called Hungry Paul, but he is just a lovely, quiet, calm man. Despite his name, you would kind of expect him to be ravenous and maybe not a calm person at all, but au contraire, he is the epitome, in a way, of mindfulness. So Leonard, his job is writing for children's encyclopedias, and he yearns to connect with someone who he can share the awe that he feels for the beauty of the universe. Hungry Paul, on the other hand, is very self-contained. He works in a post office 2 or 3 days a week because he doesn't want to take someone else's job away from them. And he seems to be very much lacking in ambition. Or he just wants to enjoy life in a day-to-day way. And he cares about the small things. He thinks about how you should sign off your emails, for instance, with great clarity and thoughtfulness. So, as you can see from my descriptions, it's a book which revels in the everyday, talks about all of the quietly important things in life, but it does have romance. And actually, there are dramas which, within this quiet, calm world that they live in, become highly dramatic. And it is actually a very moving and beautiful book, which I feel in many ways represents the way that we felt this year. Most of us have been at home far more than we normally would. We've been forced to appreciate the small things in life. And Leonard and Hungry Paul is very much a book that helps you to do that. It does have a very beautiful final image which relates to mime and that quiet art of stillness, in a way you could say represents the heart of the novel. Helen, thanks for your reply to my question. Freshwater for Flowers is fiction by French author Valérie Perrin, a beautiful book in every way. So I'm going to have to find that. Thank you very much for that. And yes, move Leonard and Hungry Paul to the top of your list because it's such a good book. Right, so how are we doing for time? I can mention a few more books. I'm going to talk to you about next. Which one shall I go for? I'm going to talk about short stories by John Lanchester. This is another really nice gift book. You can see that I've chosen all these gorgeous hardback books, which are beautiful to give to people. And this is called Reality and Other Stories by John Lanchester, who is one of my favourite modern authors, who writes all kinds of very different books. He wrote a great book called Capital that I absolutely loved, and he's written many others, both novels and short stories. So this, Reality and Other Stories, is a collection of short stories which are perfect to read by a fire over Christmas, you could easily read one every evening over the Christmas period. They are quite spooky, as is evidenced by the rather spooky cover, and they all involve modern technology in one way or another. There are mobile phones, apps, and spooky things that happen with those articles of modern technology. They're really strange and brilliant stories, which do all give you a bit of a shiver down your spine and also do make you think about using your phone and whether it's a good thing. So, possibly a good one to give to the teenagers in your life who are constantly on their phones. But it's also a great book to share with friends and maybe to read aloud, to consider reading aloud by the fire of a winter Christmassy evening. Now, Katie's just replying to me about Little Big, which she mentioned earlier, saying it's fantasy and literary about a house that never seems to end. That sounds great. Won both the Hugo Award and a prestigious literary one. Okay, I'm going to look that up, and I obviously ought to know about that. So thank you very much for mentioning it. I'm going to be checking that out. Another of my favourite and most memorable books of the year is The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. Another gorgeous and beautiful cover with gold on it. Very lovely, and a really fantastic book that challenges many preconceptions. It's set in the deep south of America, and it also moves to California. It explores the years between the 1950s and the 1990s. It delves into ideas about race, gender, and identity. It's about twins, Stella and Desiree, who are identical, but as they grow up, one of them decides they are black. One of them decides to pass herself off as white when she grows into her 20s, because it kind of happens by accident at first, and she then realizes that she could be white, so to speak, in the world that she's living in, and it's to her advantage, so she does. I love the book because it challenges so many ideas about race and identity, and also gender. It's got a really wonderful transgender character called Reese, who I love in the story. He has a very interesting trajectory, and I'd recommend the book because it has so many different levels and strands going on, all of which are totally riveting. I've also had another comment from someone who's suggesting The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which is a book that I'm dying to read and haven't yet read, which I know is brilliant, about books and alternate lives and what makes a good life, says Rosalind Campion. Thank you very much for that. I know Matt Haig is fantastic. I've read all his other books, and The Midnight Library is on my next to be read pile. And Rosalind is also mentioning The Vanishing Half. Thank you for that, which I'm talking about now. And Rosalind says she had a glorious reread of Cold Comfort Farm, which I would always recommend, especially in difficult times, which I completely agree. That is a fantastic book. So The Vanishing Half, very much an amazing, brilliant book. Great read, beautifully written. I'm just thinking I probably don't have time to read out from all of the books, but it really captures the feeling of the time back in the 50s and 60s and moving through to the 90s. There's some fantastic descriptions of Los Angeles, San Francisco, pubs and clubs of that time, living in a small town. Really great writing and a fantastic story. So, to continue with other amazing books of this year, one of my favourites also, which again makes a really gorgeous gift, Look at it with its beautiful cover, its lovely gold font, and its beautiful embossed style, is Dear Reader by Kathy Rentzenbrink, subtitled The Comfort and Joy of Books. I mean, it does actually tell you on the cover what it's all about. And Planty, yes, I will put this list on my website. I'll put it on Facebook, and I'll also put it as an Insta post. I always do that after these sessions now because I know that people would love to come back and see all these books and return to them. So, Dear Reader by Kathy Rentzenbrink. I don't know if you're familiar with Kathy's work, but she is a wonderful writer and journalist who's written two gorgeous books already. The Last Act of Love, which was about the tragic tale, which is true, of her brother being hit by a car and going into a coma and being kept alive for the next 8 years until his family really sadly had to let him go, which was The Last Act of Love. Kathy Rentzenbrink wrote about that very beautifully in that book. And she also wrote another fabulous book called A Manual for Heartache, which is another book that is about sadness and grief and about how books helped her through her sadness and grief of losing her brother. And this book, Dear Reader, is a kind of autobiography of her life in books. It is beautifully written, like all her other books, and it takes you from her childhood when she went through the wardrobe into Narnia, like so many of us did, and hopefully so many children of today are still doing that. And then it takes her through her teenage years and reading, then to the pivotal event of her young life when her brother was struck down by the car and then eventually died 8 years later. So she takes us through that period of her life and the books that she read and how they helped her to survive that terrible time. And then on to the present day when Kathy is now living in Cornwall with her own son and sharing books with him. Now, this is a book which is very chatty, very friendly, very easy to read and readable. And it actually also has little sections where you can read summaries of particular books in nice short chunks. So, for instance, she's got orphans in books. That's the place where I just coincidentally opened the book. Children's books I love to reread, including The Wind in the Willows, Little Women, Biggles Learns to Fly, etc. And she's also got lists like The Enduring Consolations of Crime. That's one of her chapter headings. Posh People Behaving Badly. That's a classic chapter heading, and it includes The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford, one of my favourites ever. And as you can see, it's very user-friendly. It's a great book to read, and it's also a lovely one to give as a gift. It's obviously not a million miles away from the novel Cure, which is more of an A to Z of literary remedies, where you can look up an ailment and find a cure for that. Kathy's book is much more of a autobiographical description of her journey through reading, which is a really lovely read and a great book to give to any of the passionate readers in your life. Now, I'd like to move on to another book that I've loved this year, which is called The Weekend by Charlotte Wood. This would be an excellent book to give to, I would say, maybe women in their 50s or 60s It's actually a book about three friends who are in their 70s, and they have all gone to spend a weekend, which is actually Christmas, in the house of their friend Sylvie, who's recently died. The three friends have gone to that house in order to try and put it in order and help to uh, sort out all the stuff that Sylvie has left behind. And while they're there, the various aspects of their friendship come to light. They spend this weekend together, and they're in their 70s. They all have a lot of baggage with them and a lot of secrets which are actually revealed during the course of the weekend. And it's a book which is superbly drawn. The characters are in it. Jude, Adele, and Wendy are really fantastic characters. It also has a rather fantastic dog who is very old and very incontinent. And one of the women has brought the dog with them, much to the horror of the others. The dog is called Finn, and Finn was actually a present from Sylvie before she died to one of the three women, but the other two women actually hate the dog, and the dog is a really great character who shuffles around and poos in all the places that it's not meant to in the house. The book is set somewhere between Sydney, Australia, and Newcastle, on the coast in what's clearly a lovely kind of beach house. And the three women spend some of their time swimming. It's unbearably hot. I think it's about 35 degrees. And the women are having quite a trying time trying to put to rest all of Sylvie's stuff, and also to come to terms with some of the aspects of their own friendship and the history between them, which is slowly emerging as the weekend goes on. It actually is a really good book to read at Christmas because it's taking place in the days leading up to Christmas. It does have some huge dramas that occur towards the end of the weekend, which I won't reveal. But I really love the way that Charlotte Wood draws the three characters. The reason I'm suggesting it as a present to give to perhaps women in their 50s and 60s is because it's such an amazing story of female friendship, maybe women in their 40s too, with a huge amount of history between them. And women of that age will really relate to their own female friendships and think about them in a new light. But I wouldn't necessarily give it to women in their 70s or 80s because it does have aspects of the truth of old age and mortality, which may not be that fun to read if you are feeling old. It is something that I have noticed in my life as a bibliotherapist, that people who are in their 70s and 80s and 90s don't necessarily enjoy reading books which are about people of that age, funnily enough. So I would now like to move on to some of the questions that I've had from people about books to give as presents. And one of the questions that I was asked was, which books would you give to someone who doesn't have that much time for reading? Now, I really love little books which are short stories in themselves, and they can make really fantastic presents. And I would say this pair of books makes a really fantastic pair of presents. So this one, Lady into Fox, is by David Garnett. And David Garnett was actually one of the Bloomsbury group. So it was written a long time ago. This is not a book of 2020. It's a strange, bizarre, and wonderful fable in a way, which is about a man who really loves his wife. It's full of uxorious descriptions of the love of his wife. And one day they go walking in the woods together. They hear the sound of a hunt coming their way. And the next thing is that the gentleman looks at his wife and she's turned into a fox. Literally, suddenly, she's a fox trotting along in the woods and looking at him with horror and confusion. She has no idea why she's suddenly become a fox. And at first, they hang out together. The fox, the lady fox, the vixen, acts as if she's still human. The husband tries to dress her in women's clothes, which is a bit weird. It does have slightly weird aspects. It has to be said, look, there is the fox dressed in some kind of strange feminine garment. They still go to bed together. They eat meals together. They play cards quite successfully, and that all goes on quite happily for the first few weeks. But slowly, the lady fox becomes more and more foxy and more wild. And she is actually far more interested in trying to catch and kill a duck than she is in trying to play cards or do more feminine and civilized things with her husband. And really, it's just a strangely fascinating tale about how the husband grieves the loss of his wife. Many would say that it's a giant metaphor for the dissolving of a marriage, but others would say that perhaps it's a giant metaphor for whether civilization is a good thing and whether it's better to be wild. It is a weirdly compelling tale. It does feel quite old-fashioned. The way that David Garnett writes is fairly old-fashioned in the way that it's phrased, but it's not a difficult read. I'll just read you a tiny little bit to give you a sense of it, because I really think it's a great one to give as a present. When he had got back, he took her flowers and at the same time set down the basket with the rabbit in it, with the lid open. Then he called to her, "Sylvia, I have brought some flowers for you. Look, the first snowdrops." At this, she ran up very prettily, and never giving as much as one glance at the rabbit, which had hopped out of its basket, she began to thank him for the flowers. Indeed, she seemed indefatigable in showing her gratitude, smelt them, stood a little way off, looking at them, then thanked him again. Mr. Tebrick, who's the husband, and this was all part of his plan, then took a vase and went to find some water for them, but left the flowers beside her. He stopped away 5 minutes, timing it by his watch and listening very intently, but never heard the rabbit squeak. Yet, when he went in, what a horrid shambles was spread before his eyes. I won't go on. But that gives you a bit of a sense of the way that David Garnett writes and his language. But that's a strangely compelling tale. Then we have Mrs. Fox by Sarah Hall, which is a short story which won many awards. And as you can see, it is very short. I think it's actually even shorter than this one. But they do make a great pair as a present. And again, it's the same story. It's about a man whose wife one day turns into a fox, but it's set in the present day. So it's actually all the more fun to read now because we can relate to the lady who turns into the vixen because she is like us. And we can also be really intrigued by the husband and how he reacts. I'll just read you a little bit of this. Sarah Hall is a fantastic writer who has written many amazing and award-winning novels. He is a man with two lives. He works, he holds conversations with office staff, shops at the supermarket. He turns down dates, but seems contented, and his colleagues wonder if he has, without declaration, moved on. Esme is re-employed, though she is sad. Sophia Garnett has left her husband and suspects injustice against her to be the cause, whatever that may be. But she finds no trace of any woman in the house, no lace underwear, no lost earring or hairs gathered in the sink. The thoughts of murder pass. That I just thinking I don't want to read you the very end of the book, which is where I was, so I'm going to stop right there. But you can see from that tiny extract that it's a much more modern book than the one that I was talking about earlier. Planty, thank you for mentioning Pigtails. Same vein, great book. That is a book I haven't yet read and I really want to read it, and I must. So thank you for that one. We do love a bit of metamorphosis in a novel. I'm a major fan of reading about metamorphosing humans one way or another, which is what I was touching on also last week with many of the mythical tales retold that I was talking about. So if you missed that session, do catch up with it on my YouTube channel or on Facebook. You'll be able to find it on my page. Next week, I'm going to be on Damien Barr's Facebook page and on his Instagram doing Bibliotherapy Live and talking about snowy literature, which I'm really looking forward to. That's being moved forward from December the 16th for various reasons. And then the week after that, I'm going to be talking about Christmas literature, Christmas stories, which will be on December the 16th. So in the meantime, if you have any other thoughts of books that have either got you through 2020, or if you have any questions about what to give to your friends and relatives in a bibliotherapeutic style, just drop me a line on Facebook or on Twitter, or send me an email to ella@ellabeartooth.com. I will post a post about all the books that I've been talking about tonight. Some of them can be found on the Damien Barr Literary Salon Facebook page, where there's a link to the Literary Salon's bookshop. And I have recommended some books on there, so you can navigate your way to that. I'll also put a link to that after this evening. But thank you so much for joining me. It was lovely to see you all, and I look forward to seeing you next week on Damien's page. Good night.